Hi, this is History with me, Dan. One of the major recent landmarks in the city of Hartford, Connecticut is Dunkin' Donuts Park, which was recently shortened to Duncan Park. This baseball field was completed in 2017 as the first part of a major redevelopment of Hartford's downtown North District. Duncan Park is located along Main Street between Trumbull Street on the south and Pleasant Street on the north. In this video, I'm not going to talk about the ballpark itself or the drama associated with its delayed construction. Instead, I'm going to focus on what used to be here about 100 years ago, back when this was a densely built-up section of Main Street. There were many Jewish-owned businesses here at the time, which included a number of furniture stores. There was also a notable hotel that was at the center of a notorious trial back in 1872. As I mentioned, Duncan Park is located between Pleasant and Trumbull in what's now known as Hartford's Dono or Downtown North section, which centers on a stretch of Main Street north of Interstate 84 and south of the intersection with Albany Avenue. This was an area that was completely transformed in the 1960s when the highway was built right through the city. As shown in this section of the 1965 Aerial Survey of Connecticut, a huge swath of buildings north of Morgan Street and east of Main Street were demolished. On the east side of Main, the landmarks of the Keeney Tower and Barnard Brown School survived, as did the Chevrolet dealership just south of them. This dealership continued through the 1970s, but it was eventually replaced with a parking lot, and that remained until Duncan Park was built here. The area just across the street, between Main and the highway, still had buildings in 1965, but this area would also eventually become a parking lot, and it remains so to this day, awaiting redevelopment as part of downtown North. This vicinity was very different over a century ago, as revealed in this section from the Hartford Atlas of 1917. The current area of Duncan Park is outlined in red. The rough triangle bound by Main Street on the west, Pleasant Street on the north, and Windsor Street on the east was filled with buildings, and there were even two streets here that are now lost. Orchard Street coming in from Windsor Street, and Goodman Place coming on from Main. Long before the coming of the interstate or Duncan Park, this area had already experienced a major transformation. In 1929, 12 years after the 1917 Atlas, the city undertook a widening of Main Street on the northeast side. Many of the buildings here were either removed, completely replaced, or their front sections were taken off to conform with the new street line. After the widening, Trumbull Street, which intersected Main here from the south, was extended northeast through this area to intersect with Windsor Street. In the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about part of the block of Main that was transformed in 1929, going from the modern intersection with Trumbull Street and heading north to Pleasant Street. Let's start with a building that was removed for the Trumbull Street extension. On the left is a circa 1928 view north up Trumbull towards the intersection with Main. The building at 1136 to 1140 Main, in the distance, had replaced an earlier Italianate-style house with a cupola that had once stood here, as shown on the right in a section of a stereograph from the 1860s. At some point afterwards, the house was replaced by the four-story structure which had prominent twin bay windows on its upper floors. By 1929, this building was directly in the path of the extension of Trumbull Street, and it would be torn down. For many years, it had been the home of the Hoffman Wall Paper Co. This business was started in 1903 by Abraham Hoffman, a Jewish immigrant from Russia who settled in Hartford in 1898. Over the years, Hoffman Wallpaper would grow to become one of the largest paint distributors in New England. When their building was slated for demolition, the company moved to the northwest corner of Asylum and Ann Streets, and it would move again to 306 Market Street in 1956. Just north of the Hoffman Building was a 5-story mansard roof building at 1150 to 1152 Main Street that had a store on the first floor, while in the floors above was the Sigourney House Hotel, a boarding house no doubt named in honor of the well-known Hartford poet Lydia Huntley Sigourney. The building was erected in 1869 by a Mr. B. E. Buck. This section from the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford shows that, like the Italianate house next door that I mentioned earlier, the Sigourney house originally also had a rooftop cupola, which it would lose before the end of the century. Before the buildings on Main Street were all renumbered in 1898, the Sigourney house had the address of 554 Main Street. The first proprietor of the boarding house was Mrs. Anna C. Downs. Unfortunately, business did not go well, and in early 1872, she fell out with Mr. Buck, the owner of the building. As the Hartford Courant newspaper reported, quote, "In a fit of anger, she wrote a somewhat insulting note to Mr. Buck's wife, and in this she gave notice that she should leave the house, and in such terms that she could not legally retain possession after March 15th, unquote. In the early morning hours of Sunday, March 3rd, 1872, a boarder staying on the 5th floor was alarmed to discover smoke pouring into his room. He raised the alarm, and soon the whole house was awake. Fires were discovered in unoccupied rooms on the 4th and 5th floors, and there was also a blaze in the 2nd floor dining room. The boarders were able to enter the dining room, all the doors of which were still locked from the night before, and douse the flames, aided by the porter, who was an African-American man named John W. Scott, and the chambermaid, who was named Eliza Smith. Firefighters soon arrived and put out the fire in the upper rooms. Fortunately, none of the 40 to 50 boarders, which included some children, were harmed, and the damage to the building was slight. Investigation revealed, however, that the ignited rooms had been deliberately doused in kerosene and alcohol, and on the 4th floor, a full box of matches had been placed next to the steam boiler pipe. As the Courant reported, quote, "A gentleman connected with one of our leading fire insurance companies says that in all his experience he has never known of a more wicked or dastardly attempt to destroy property. While the plot was one of the most desperate, it was yet one of the most foolish. It shows on its face to have been the work of a bungler. An expert would not have so scattered the evidence of the crime. The doors of the room in which the fire was started would not have been closed, and all ventilation shut off to smother the flames. More absolute certainty of success would have been secured by starting a fire in a single exposed place. But to the fact that the plot was rash and ill-conceived is undoubtedly due the result that the foul intent of the designer was frustrated." Unquote. Mrs. Downs was arrested for arson, her presumed motives being her desire for revenge against Mr. Buck, who had already chosen a new proprietor for the Sigourney house, and the fact that she had overinsured the hotel furniture for $8,000 when it was not worth a third of that amount. On July 25, 1872, a large number of spectators witnessed the final day of Downes's trial in Superior Court. One of her defense lawyers was Hartford's new mayor, Henry C. Robinson, who made the closing argument. As the Current described it, quote, "Like all his efforts at the bar or in public, it was a fine production, not only as an argument, but in its whole thought and finish." At this time, the courtroom was overcrowded with spectators. At about 3 o'clock, His Honor, Judge Minor, charged the jury. The charge was brief, but unmistakably in favor of the prisoner, so far as a judge's address to a jury may be so considered. In the presentation of the legal requirements of the case, and especially as relates to the value and consistency of circumstantial testimony, it gave the jury a very comprehensive idea of the merits of the whole case before them, and must have aided them in forming a quick opinion in making up their verdict. The jury's retirement lasted probably 15 minutes, and they came in agreed. In response to each count, the foreman answered, "Not guilty," and the same on the whole together, and the result was received with a considerable demonstration of applause to the spectators, which the sheriff instantly repressed, and the court gave orders to have any person found applauding brought before him. The verdict gave special satisfaction to the immediate friends of Mrs. Downes. She was first congratulated by her counsel, then several of her lady companions kissed her, and the scene altogether was a very congratulatory one. Mrs. Downes meantime displayed no unusual emotion. In company with friends, she soon left the court and departed in a carriage. One of the ladies present was so overjoyed that she sought out as many jurors as she could find, and shook them warmly by the hand, and extended her own thanks for the verdict." Unquote. Soon, William Coyle and his wife, Nancy Jane Bill, took over proprietorship of the Sigourney house. As the Current reported on September 26, 1915, quote, "William Coyle died in 1875, and from that time until her death in 1913, Mrs. Coyle continued to run the hotel and made it a home-like place that it was always reputed to be. At the time of her husband's death, Mrs. Coyle was 44 years old, an age when most women would have hesitated before venturing into a field where there was so much competition and hardship. With 3 children to care for, Mrs. Coyle went ahead with her characteristic Yankee fortitude and common sense, and within 5 years from the time of her husband's death, had brought the reputation of the house to the highest point. The Sigourney house was known in nearly every city in the country, and people from all parts of the world have stopped there. Missionaries, preachers, actors, actresses, salesmen, educators, lecturers, financial kings, and authors have stopped there." Unquote. Among the many who boarded at the Sigourney house for a time was James W. Page, inventor of the Page compositor. Mark Twain's heavy investment in this failed typesetting machine was a major factor that led to the famous humorist's bankruptcy. Beyond the Sigourney house was a row of 4-story Italianate-style commercial buildings, built in the 1870s. Of the 4 stores on these buildings' ground floors in 1928, 3 were furniture stores, and the other was Sechtman's Hardware and Toy Store at 1162 Main Street. When that building was demolished due to the road widening, the Sechtman Hardware Company moved to a new building on Governor Street and switched from being a retail store to becoming Hartford's only hardware jobber doing an exclusively wholesale business. Between Sechtman's and the intersection with Goodman Place were the Gruber Furniture Company and the John Hanson Furniture Company. The Gruber Furniture Company first opened here in 1920, when Israel Gruber and his partner Nathan Harrop bought out the previous furniture store at 1170 to 72 Main Street owned by A. Shiner. Gruber had previously worked as manager of Lewis Harrop's store, and his partner Nathan was Lewis's brother. By the following year, Gruber and Harrop had become the Gruber Furniture Company. Next door was John Hanson's furniture store. Hanson had been the manager of Lucius T. Fenn's well-known furniture store on Main Street. In 1916, he bought out that company and opened his own store at 1100 Main Street, later moving to larger quarters here at 1174 to 1180 in 1923. As I mentioned, all of this was demolished and replaced due to the street widening. The photo on the left shows demolition work underway on the structures north of the Sigourney house. This photo is a northeast view of Goodman Place and the stores of Hanson, Gruber, and Sechtman in 1928, and this photo shows the same corner in 1929 after the widening. The old mansard-roofed Sigourney house had been cut back 22 feet and given a new front of pressed brick and granite to the designs of architect Edward M. Stone. The building next door was replaced by a new 4-story structure at the corner of Goodman Place, designed by the architectural firm of Berenson and Moses. Gruber Furniture moved into the new building and remained here less than 2 years before the onset of the Great Depression forced the company into bankruptcy in 1931. Luckily, within a few months, Israel Gruber and his son Herman reopened their store just a few doors up Main Street. John Hanson also moved into the new building, again taking up the store location at the corner of Goodman Place. His store would remain here until it also moved in 1945. So far, I've been talking about the buildings south of Goodman Place. Now let's consider the buildings from Goodman Place to Pleasant Street. Before we move on, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you are enjoying this video, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. Thank you very much. This photograph is a view northwestward up Main Street towards the intersection with Ann Street and Albany Avenue, with the Keeney Tower in the distance on the right. Just south of it is the Barnard Brown School. The picture, taken on November 15, 1929, shows the trolley tracks being moved to the center of the street as part of the street widening project. Across the street, beyond the frame of this picture to the right, the building at 1192 to 1202 Main Street, which was just north of Goodman Place, was demolished. Also demolished was the mansard-roofed building at 1204 to 1214 Main, shown on the left in 1928. On the left side of this building's front facade, there was a passageway that had once led to a stable in the rear. This stable was replaced in 1920 by a fireproof garage. The garage was run by a company called Tabor Rogers, which sold Duplex and Republic trucks and then Durant automobiles. In 1922, the space was taken over by McNamara's Garage. As I said, the building in front of the garage was demolished in 1929. So after that, the garage at 1214 Main Street fronted directly onto the street. The adjacent building at 1216 to 18 Main Street was cut back 27 feet from the road and was given a new front. In 1933, the Beeman Griffin car dealership took over the garage space. Tragedy struck this company in November of 1934 when one of its car salesmen, Ralph A. Brown of Rocky Hill, committed suicide by inhaling carbon monoxide inside of an automobile in the garage. In 1936, the Sloat Chevrolet dealership took over the property. 12 years later, in 1948, Sloat moved into a new auto center at 1 Myrtle Street near Union Station, at a location that was named Sloat Square in honor of the company's president, Henry M. Sloat. Sloat Chevrolet eventually went out of business in 1955. As for the old garage on Main Street, it was taken over by Capital Motors, which soon erected a brand new facility on the property. Later, when everything else was gone from the future Duncan Park property, this car dealership remained. In 1973, Capital Motors was taken over by John O'Keefe, who renamed it O'Keefe Chevrolet. It remained in business until 1981. The building here was eventually demolished, but Duncan Park today has its former address, 1214 Main Street, which goes all the way back to the old garage at this site. Let's return to the building at 1216 to 1218 Main Street as it was in 1929, just before, as I mentioned, it was cut back 27 feet and given a new front. For the previous 12 years, this building had been rented by Max Feinberg's furniture store. But in 1929, the store had erected a new 2-story building of buff brick at 1260 Main Street. This was located just north of Pleasant Street and adjacent to the Barnard Brown School. Feinberg remained at the new location until 1936. Other businesses then used the building, which was eventually torn down some years later. The buildings between Feinberg's 2 locations were all demolished for the street widening. This photo shows those buildings to the left of Feinberg's earlier building before they were demolished. One was a 4-story building, the other was a 3.5-story building that extended to the corner of Pleasant Street. This would be the northeast corner of the ballpark today, where the Etna Community Center is now located. This is a 1929 view southeast down Main Street after the widening. With the area I've been talking about on the left, it shows the new building south of Goodman Place that I mentioned before, the Feinberg building before its front was removed, and the new building designed by the architectural firm of Ebbets and Frid that was built on the southeast corner of Main and Pleasant Streets. This picture also shows the row of buildings on the other side of the street. This area is now a parking lot, which is awaiting redevelopment. At a spot where there is now an extension of Pleasant Street was a movie theater that in 1929 was called the Liberty Theater. It had opened in 1913 as the Star Theater and would later be known as the Daily Theater. Thanks for watching this video about Old Hartford. And next time you go to a game at Duncan Park, think about all the buildings, businesses, and people that once had a home here.